part of the emphasis of critical and cultural theories is culture, because they're getting critical cultural theories. And so there's a strong emphasis upon culture and understanding that culture is completely fabricated. Not saying that culture doesn't matter, that cultural traditions doesn't matter, that history doesn't matter, but recognizing that these are fabrications, right? So within our own culture, the dress, dominant Western culture, right? That's what men are to wear, what women are to wear, as we've talked about before. That varies by time, but that's even just here in the West. We can look at comparisons to other parts of the globe and what's appropriate dress. I mean, think about display of the body and nudity in Western culture and how that's seen versus other cultures around the globe. Yeah, right. And even here in Western culture, what's appropriate to show for certain amount of time women were not to ever show their legs. They actually kept quite the sort of, décolleté, right? But or exposed décolleté. Yeah, so culture is completely fabricated, right? So culture is completely fabricated, obvious links in there to discussion of gender. But that's the important understanding, is that it's all completely fabricated. And so within culture, and your book makes mention of this, that cultural and critical perspectives are very interested in the categories that we have. And that's like what we're doing in this class, right? What are the categories we have of what's masculine and what's feminine? Why are some things considered, I mean, there's appropriate and inappropriate, but why are some things considered low class, which is a judgmental statement, right? Why is something considered low class, something else is considered appropriate? What sorts of things are considered appropriate professional behavior? Right, appropriately professional. A quick example or sort of an illustration of this is that Barbara Walters, who's mostly retired from journalism now, you might be familiar with her. She started The View, she was on 2020. She one time co-hosted the national news with Chet Huntley, I believe. And while doing that, she was pregnant and she had a miscarriage. And I think she missed maybe one night of the news, but your personal life, your professional, your personal life is not supposed to intersect. And so if you miscarry in the morning, you get back to work that evening, sort of thing. Otherwise, you're going to be seen as weak, right? Because that notion of what does it mean to be a professional? It's about not having a personal life. I remember a professor of mine in grad school saying, she said, listen, for a long time when women were working, you basically had a baby in a ditch and got back to work. The point being, we don't want to hear about this baby and why you need time off. This is why we don't take you seriously as a woman, right? So these categories of male and female, professional, what is low class, what's the serious worker, those categories become the object of study. And very much we're interested in who created them. Who created those categories and who do they benefit? Go back to our discussion of hegemony and privilege and often patriarchy, right? So you'll see a real clear pattern there. But who created those categories, right? Those different categories. And even when we think about race, so there are terms that have thankfully, I believe, disappeared from our language, and they really sort of are sort of seen as archaic. But a term like mulatto, meaning a person who had a black and a white parent as a person. The person was considered mulatto. They were put in that category of mulatto, as opposed to also, and these are the terms, right? A quadroon or a person was an octoroon, had to do with how much heritage they had that was black. And so these categories are created. Well, who's creating those categories? Well, it's a bunch of white people deciding whether or not they're going to sort of let you in the white club or not, right? And this goes to this question that my professor, when I was an undergrad, actually, Elizabeth Meckling, I believe now retired at Cal State Fullerton, used to always say is quo bono, right? Quo bono. So if you know your Latin, that's who benefits. So the categories, these categories are created are the object of study. What is that category and why? And asking, so who created them? But it often tells us who benefits from those categories, right? So what are the categories? Who created them? And who's benefiting from those categories, right? Those are some of those key questions of critical cultural theories, because all of this is power oriented. Right? It's all power oriented to understand how culture is fabricated in a certain way with certain categories created to thus benefit certain people in terms of representing their experience and keeping them in places of influence, of power, of choices being made that really reflect them and their needs and their interests. Right? So that's part of this critical cultural perspective. as we're talking about culture, more closely to the discussion we had briefly before about ethnicity, that culture as being related to where we've lived, the cultural groups we've grown up in, right? Within the global perspectives, right? So we get these global or perspectives on that look at right, how has culture been formed in different places and in different ways? But then, because we're very interested in power, what has been the effect and function of ethnocentrism? How have those in power come to judge others, right? Because ethnocentrism is about the judging, well, centrism, it's central, right? And ethno, and as in like a culture, right? One culture is central. And what's key that is that one culture is central and it's what all other cultures are judged against. So here in the United States, right, we could talk about different sort of slicing of culture, but it's the, straight white Protestant middle class culture is how we judge all other cultures, right? That's sort of central. It's how we judge all other cultures. Think about how many presidential addresses you've heard that often end with God bless you and God bless the United States of America, right? And multiple cultures have God, but yet that's often a reference to a Christian or Judeo-Christian God, right? And so keeping that is central. So those who don't follow in that tradition of either following a different religious tradition or identifying as agnostic or atheist, right? It goes to marginalize. And so that global perspective, very much the interest here is in how is it that we, in our own culture here in the United States, how is it that we look at um, other cultures? How is it that we look at cultures outside of those that are in the majority, and how are they impacted and affected by ethnocentrism? And so we get then in all this notion of post-colonialism, right? So colonialism is dead, right? No more countries, well, supposedly, going around planting flags claiming land. It still happens some. We could look at the Crimea, right? But you still, right? But for the most part, we don't have this anymore of going and claiming land. And by the way, in the the claims of land, listening to this podcast, actually it's about U.S. presidents, but it was in the 19th century, and it's talking about the way that the treaties were being formed between the U.S. government and Native American tribes, and they would simply go to one sort of community within a larger Native American nation and get them to sign the treaty and sometimes even these communities of 50 people, getting them to sign agreements that would impact thousands of people within that nation, right? But saying, yeah, fine, whatever, and yeah, right. It's just you had a lot of claiming land, and so what you had were then Native Americans here, and then all the Europeans. It's Portugal and Spain and Britain and France. Then the U.S. comes along, right? And we're all fighting over these pieces of land. So that's colonialism as we think about it. So that's all past us. Well, now we get post-colonialism, which is the ways in which dominant countries end up impacting other less influential countries and cultures, right? That part of that post-colonialism. Um, and so the way that other countries and cultures have to do things to meet the needs of dominant countries and dominant cultures, right? Just anyway, yeah, so that's right. So that's post-colonialism, and part of post-colonialism is this co-opting or appropriation of other cultures, which is to take something from someone else's culture when you're in the majority, in a position of privilege and power, to take something from somebody else's culture, you co-opt it, you take it, just use it as your own, you appropriate it, use it as your own, you play with it, you do something fun with it, right? That is an example of post-colonialism, right? That now it's no longer about the actual claiming of land, but the taking over of culture. The taking over of culture. That's happened in many ways, even just in the fact that Western media, especially media from the U.S., is globally shared and impacted, and therefore we end up impacting and modifying the cultural habits of other places through the production of our media. There is the fact that the way that cultures sometimes have to realign in small nations and in poor struggling nations, they realign themselves in ways so they can produce products for other larger nations as part of post-colonialism. But again, in communication and study of gender, I'm very much interested in the way that, and as a cultural critic, and how we co-opt or otherwise we appropriate elements of culture. An example of this would be this, which is from the, I believe, the 2012 Victoria's Secret show. By the way, Victoria's Secret did things like this, repeatedly appropriating, this is Native American culture, but also appropriating Eastern culture. And so here we have what is to represent Native American ceremonial headdress worn by a woman who is very likely not Native American, right? But it's part of a sacred or respected cultural tradition being put on just to be fun and cute and sexy. You know what I mean? It's not done with any sort of real reverence. It's done as part of selling lingerie. What is especially troublesome about this very specific example, right, that you're looking at there, right, is that at the show, it was an outfit for each of the 12 months. This was the outfit for, can you guess it, the month of November, recognizing Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, in which we celebrate, all the good things of this nation, but historically is rooted in celebrating the success of the pilgrims from Europe surviving here in the U.S., but the way that also brought about the death through disease and also through war of many Native Americans, where a genocide was brought about. So, yeah, by the way, when this was actually broadcast, this particular moment, because it was so problematic, was not actually in the broadcast of the Victoria's Secret fashion show, right? But this is about co-opting. So she's wearing part of another culture, just pretty fun, fool around, just sort of be fun with it. It's completely disrespectful of culture. So we're going to pause here, and I'm going to pick back up with this in our live synchronous class on Wednesday. I'm going to say that should be the 9th, I believe is what that is, right? Yes. So on Wednesday, September 9th, I'll pick back up to conclude this final portion on critical cultural theories. Please bring questions from all of this about Chapter 2. Anything the book has said, anything I've said, I'll be glad to discuss it with you. Thank you all.